Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second installment of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire's Global Tipping Points Speaker Series, Climate Change and National Security. We are so happy you decided to join us this evening. And for those of you who are watching the replay, we're excited you're engaging with the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire's programming. I do hope that you're all staying well, both physically and mentally, in these trying times, and are glad you are part of our global community. With coronavirus still a worry for many, community support is the only way we will come out of this crisis stronger. My name is Rob Werner, and I am the New Hampshire State Director for the League of Conservation Voters. LCV is a national environmental nonprofit that works to influence policy, hold politicians accountable, and win elections. The implications of global climate change on our national security and foreign policy decisions is of increasing importance. From the resilience of our military installations to increased migration that adds to regional instability around the world. LCV is committed to climate action and solutions, building support for a just transition to a clean energy economy that will benefit our environment and our citizens. LCV is glad to host a series of programs with the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. As a membership organization, the Council is supported by a generous community of global citizens. Those programs are made possible by these members and donors, ensuring the Council's work can continue. We thank and appreciate everyone who assists the Council and hope that if you are not yet a member, that you will consider joining or donating to help keep these programs alive. You can find more information on our membership here on our website, worldaffairscouncilnh.org, WACNH.org, or make a tax-deductible contribution to the organization by texting WACNH to 44321. Your help is greatly appreciated. We would also like to thank the Henry M. Jackson Foundation for their generous support for the Global Tipping Point series. In addition, we would like to thank our mission partner, Southern New Hampshire University, for all the support they have provided over the past 20 years. The Council is stronger for your assistance. Also, as a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, the Council does not promote a political position, party, issue, or candidate. We are here to provide a platform for discussion and hope you will draw your own conclusions from the information presented. Therefore, the content of tonight's program contains the views of the speakers and do not necessarily represent those of the Council, its board of directors, staff, sponsors, or members. For those who it is their first time watching one of these events, welcome. We'll be taking questions throughout tonight, so please do send us your queries so we can have a full and robust discussion after our three speakers finish their opening remarks. You can send your questions to our email address at council@wacnh.org, send them to our social media accounts, or using the Messenger app on the bottom right of our website. I'll turn the program over now to World Affairs Council of New Hampshire board member Maura Sullivan, who will tell us more about tonight's topics and introduce our speakers. Thanks, Maura.
Great, and thank you, Rob, very much for that introduction, and good evening, everybody, and welcome. We are so thrilled that all of you have joined us tonight here at the World Affairs Council. My name is Maura Sullivan, as Rob mentioned. I'm a United States Marine Corps Iraq veteran, a former senior Pentagon official in the Obama administration, a proud board member of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire, and resident on our seacoast in Portsmouth. Thank you again for joining us here from all around New Hampshire and all around the globe for this very special evening. It is my distinct privilege tonight to introduce our distinguished keynote speaker, who I had the incredible honor of working for and serving with in the Obama administration during his tenure as the longest serving Secretary of the Navy since World War I. A former governor, U.S. ambassador, CEO, service secretary, mentor, and friend. Ladies and gentlemen, I am so proud to welcome back to the Granite State a true patriot, a gifted leader, and great American, Ray Mabus. Secretary, well, I was going to say a little bit more about you.
I'm not sure they understand anymore about me.
Give me just another minute. See, there's just too much content here. Secretary Ray Mabus served as the 75th United States Secretary of the Navy from 2009 to 2017, where he led both the Navy and the Marine Corps. And as Secretary during President Obama's entire administration, he revolutionized the Navy and the Marine Corps, opening all jobs to women, aggressively moving toward alternative energy as a warfighting measure through his Great Green Fleet initiative, which we'll talk about tonight, and building more than twice as many ships during his term than in the preceding 8 years. From 1988 to 92, he served as the governor of Mississippi, and from 1994 to 1996, served as the U.S. ambassador to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. He's a native of Mississippi, which I'm sure he'll tell you about, has thrown out, and I can personally attest to this because I was with him for some of these, the first pitch at all 30 major league ballparks. But be sure to ask him who his favorite team is. I have a feeling many of us here will have that in common. And prior to his degree from Ole Miss, from Harvard Law School and Johns Hopkins, Secretary Mabus later earned his service in the Navy above the cruiser, the USS Little Rock. And finally, and then I will turn it over to the Secretary, there's simply not enough time to share all of the highlights from Secretary Mabus's 8 years as the Secretary of the Navy. But those of us who know and were privileged to serve with him recall him as such. He's a leader who took on tough but worthy fights and won. He's a man who did not what was popular, but what was right for his sailors and Marines. He's a leader who built a team of civilians, Navy SEALs, Marines, and sailors who recognized both his character and commitment and would run through walls for him. A leader who did more for women in the military in advancing the war-fighting principles to combat climate change than perhaps any of his Pentagon contemporaries. You know, there is a saying in the Marines where I served from 2001 to 2006, that in a Marine you will find no better friend. There is perhaps no higher compliment than I can pay to Secretary Mabus than to say that that is no better friend what he is to the men and women of the United States Naval Service. And with that, it is my honor and privilege to turn it over to Secretary Ray Mabus.
Mara, thank you so much. And I will try my best to live up to at least a small part of that introduction. To get off on the right foot and answer Mara's question, of course, I'm a Red Sox fan. I went to law school down the road in Cambridge and was there for the '75 World Series and got to go to a couple of games. It was all over with then. I became a lifelong Red Sox fan, and I didn't know at the time in the mid-'70s there'd be quite as much pain involved. But since the turn of this century, we've done pretty well. And I've brought up all three of my children to be Red Sox fans. So, and I want to thank the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire, the League of Conservation Voters, for hosting this incredibly important topic and series, and to my fellow panel members who have done so much to work on the issues that we're going to be talking about tonight. So, climate change as a national security issue. It is a national security issue. It is an existential issue, which makes it a security issue. And it is in a myriad of ways. The first, most obvious, most visible way is on our bases. We have someone from Norfolk here with us tonight who will speak much more to this. But if we don't do something pretty soon about arresting sea level rise, the largest naval base in the world, Norfolk, Virginia, will go underwater. And it's not just naval bases. Camp Lejeune in North Carolina, almost destroyed by a hurricane. And it's not just Navy and Marine bases on the water. Offutt Air Force Base in the middle of the country in Nebraska went underwater because of flooding, severe, once in every 500 years, theoretically, flooding from a nearby river. And you in New Hampshire can see it firsthand because of the Portsmouth Naval Facility that I have visited many, many times, and which is crucial to our Navy and to our nation. But past the bases, when storms get more intense and more frequent, when droughts get more intense and last longer, when floods get more intense and deeper, and when all these cataclysmic weather events, when fires become more frequent and more intense, all these cataclysmic weather events, no matter where they happen in the world, the U.S. military, particularly the Navy and Marines, are the world's first responders. We go everywhere to meet this. And when you send sailors, Marines, or soldiers, airmen, Coast Guardsmen into dangerous situations, when these weather events, a lot of times what they cause is instability. Instability can lead to chaos, and chaos can lead to conflict. And so you're raising the stakes dramatically for our armed forces. Third, there's a new ocean opening up. It'll be the last one that will ever open on this planet, and that's the Arctic. The fabled Northwest Passage is now available for shipping in the summer. Pretty soon, we're going to have a completely ice-free Arctic, particularly in the summer. And with that comes enormous challenges. Number one is just search and rescue. You're seeing cruise ships already go into the Arctic, and there are no search and rescue operations anywhere close in case there's a major accident. But more concerning is the fact that Russia has said that the waters north of them in the Arctic are their internal waterways. They're not. Under international law, under any way you look at it, they're international waterways. But Russia is heavily militarizing the Arctic. They're reopening some old Soviet-era installations. They're building new ones. They have more than 40 icebreakers, and they have and are developing the capability to try to decide who gets to use that waterway, who gets to go through. And the only organization that could probably keep it open is the United States Navy. You're also looking at the competition for the resources that are suddenly available on the Arctic floor, whether it's oil and gas, rare earth minerals, and everything else. China is an Arctic Council observer. They call themselves a near Arctic nation, which is an interesting piece of geography. But they are building very modern, state-of-the-art icebreakers, and they have become incredibly active in the Arctic. And so as you're seeing this search for resources, this search for influence, the search for control, what you're seeing is a pretty dramatic ratcheting up of the potential for something to happen, the potential for something, for a mistake to spiral out of control and to become an open conflict in the Arctic. Another way is when people cannot live somewhere because of droughts, because of floods, because of extreme weather events, when they can't live there because they can't grow food, when they can't live there because they can't get fresh water, then what you're seeing, and you're already seeing it in big measure, is people leave and they become part of these huge immigration streams. You're seeing it out of the Sahel in Africa, heading toward Europe. You're seeing it all around the world as people leave untenable places. And that's another place that our military and our security will be called into question. And even here in the US, we already have internally displaced climate refugees. Islands in Louisiana have been going underwater, and people there have begun to leave and to move, and our government has to facilitate that. There's an island off the coast of Maryland, which is also threatened right now, and which will probably go underwater. The island nation of Kiribati in the South Pacific is 1 meter average above sea level. And when I visited there, the president of Kiribati said that he thought his the biggest job he had to do was convince people to leave, because you can lose an entire nation. So climate change threatens us and our military and our national security in so many ways. And that's one of the reasons, the main reason, that when I became secretary, I thought that we should try to do something about it, because the Department of the Navy and Marines are so big, 900,000 people, $170 billion budget. But the Pentagon, the largest user of fossil fuels on Earth, the Pentagon uses 2% of all fossil fuels used in the United States. And so we were big enough that if we changed, we could bring a market. And so many times the things that started in the Pentagon then moved to the private sector. Now, you can look at ubiquitous things like the internet itself, GPS, flat screen TVs. Those all started as military projects and have now become universal in the civilian world. So in 2009, about 5 months after I came in, I developed some goals for the Navy and Marines. And I'd done this because when I was being briefed for my confirmation hearings, when I was being briefed to become Secretary of the Navy, one of the things that had jumped out at me was how energy, fuel, could be used as a weapon, either for you or against you. And in my first 2 years at the Pentagon, because of surging oil prices at that time, so 2009, 2010, I was presented with $2 billion in unbudgeted fuel price increases. And even in the Pentagon, finding a couple of $1 billion is not an easy job. And we were beginning to have to make decisions like we were going to steam less or fly less or train less. And if it got much worse, we were going to have to simply quit buying as many ships and aircraft because we could not afford to fuel them. And then a lot of times our fuel was coming from our energy, our fuel was coming from people who might not have our best interest at heart. A great example is Singapore. We refuel a lot of our ships in the Western Pacific from a Chinese oil refinery in Singapore. Right down the road is a biofuel refinery owned by the Finns. I don't particularly want to depend on the Chinese for my fuel, for my warships in the Western Pacific. So in October of 2009, I came up with 5 goals for the Navy. And the biggest one was that by no later than 2020, so the year that we're in, at least half of all naval energy afloat and ashore would come from non-fossil fuel sources. At the time that I made the announcement, the technology, frankly, wasn't there. I took a lot of heat, particularly from members of Congress who were from oil-producing regions or states. One committee member, one Armed Services Committee member, literally yelled at me and said, "You're the Secretary of the Navy. You're not the Secretary of Energy, so quit this." And I had two responses. One, which was a little bit flip, was, "No, I'm not the Secretary of Energy. I've got more money than he does." But the second one was, the Navy has always been at the forefront when we change energy sources. We went from sail to coal in the middle of the 19th century. We went from coal to oil at the beginning of the 20th century. And we pioneered the use of nuclear for propulsion in the middle of the 20th century. And every single time, there were all these naysayers saying this cannot be done. This, you're trading something that's free, the wind, for something that costs money, coal. Or you're trading all these coaling stations that we've set up around the world for this unproven commodity called oil. Or you will never, ever create a nuclear reactor small enough or safe enough to fit into a submarine. And every time, and this time, those naysayers were absolutely wrong. So I did it for the strategic reasons that I talked about, but I also did it for more personal reasons. When I got there, we were losing a Marine, killed or wounded, for every 50 convoys of fuel we took into Afghanistan. That was too high a price to pay. And so we began to, the 1st, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, when they were heading into Afghanistan to Sangin in some of the hottest fighting there, literally on the way out the door, we gave them solar panels, rollable solar panels that they could put into their pack. And it saved a company of Marines 700 pounds of batteries that they didn't have to haul around. And they didn't have to be resupplied. And so now Marines, who you don't think of as ardent environmentalists, are on the leading edge of making energy where they are, making energy where they're going to fight. And they have become the very front of the tip of the spear in those terms. A Navy SEAL team commander told me that when they went to alternative energy, so solar and wind in the field, that the amazing thing happened. They turned off the generator and they could hear. And so suddenly, if bad people were trying to sneak up on them, they could hear and they knew when they were coming. And also, it took a big target off their back, because before, all you had to do was say, there's the generator, there's the Americans, go there. So how'd we do? Well, by 2015, by the end of 2015, so 5 years ahead of schedule, we met the onshore requirement. And today, 2/3 of all energy on Navy and Marine Corps bases comes from renewable sources, from non-fossil fuel sources. In the air and on the water, 40% comes from non-fossil fuel sources. We're 17% nuclear, but the rest is from biofuels. Maura mentioned the Great Green Fleet. We sent a carrier strike group on a normal deployment. But the demonstration was that entire carrier strike force. So the carrier, its screening vessels, its support ships, all the aircraft were running on biofuel. And we only had 3 requirements for biofuel. One is it couldn't take any land out of food production. 2 is it had to be a drop-in fuel. We weren't going to change our engines or even our settings. And 3, it had to lower our carbon footprint dramatically, and it had to be cost competitive. And we were able to do that by the end. And now when the Pentagon puts out a requirement for fuel, they don't say biofuels anymore, or they don't say traditional oil and gas. They just say fuel. And biofuel companies are growing up in a pretty fast and large number to meet that need. In fact, the Navy, using the Defense Production Act, which you've heard a lot about recently in terms of COVID, we invested in 3 different biofuel plants, and 2 of them are coming online or are online today. And by the way, when we moved to alternatives on our basis, we saved $400 million by doing it. So today, you don't have to make a choice between, if you're in the private sector or in government, between your bottom line and doing what's right for the environment. They coincide now. Solar, wind, geothermal, hydrothermal are all cheaper now than any fossil fuels. And one of the things that you should be concerned about and that you hear a lot about are jobs and the jobs that will be lost in the fossil fuel industry. And that's one thing that we've got to do a better job in government. As this changes, as we move to renewables to fight climate change, as we move to renewables to begin to heal the earth, we have got to take care of the people who work in the industries that produce fossil fuels today. We've got to make sure that their transition through job training, through various types of government programs is smooth and does not require huge sacrifices on those individuals and their families. But even today, the solar industry has more employees than all fossil fuel industries put together. I'll tell you 3 quick stories, and then I'll finish. One of my favorite expressions from my time as ambassador in Saudi Arabia, and that's the first time I really saw the power of oil and what it could do, was a former Saudi oil minister, Zaki Yamani, who said, the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones. It ended because we invented something better. And that's what we're in the process of doing now. And I think we're past the tipping point now, that regardless of government, regardless of anything, this movement toward renewables, this movement toward much lower carbon, this movement toward trying to arrest and adapt to climate change is not going to slow down. But the 2 stories that I'll tell, one is I flew backseat in the very first aircraft that went supersonic on 100% biofuels. So that was how much confidence I had in that. But second, during the Great Green Fleet, we refueled the ships from 8 other nations, 8 other participants in the largest naval exercise in the world, the Rim of the Pacific, that happens every 2 years off the coast of Hawaii. And we signed an agreement with the head of Navy from Australia to share research, to share findings, to share information, just like we've done now with Korea, South Korea, and with Italy, and with several other countries. But then Australia was going to be the first, and he flew over to the USS Nimitz, which was the carrier. And we had a big press contingent. And they asked him, they said, how committed are you to this biofuel initiative? And he looked and he said, I just flew over here on that helicopter. It's being refueled with biofuels. I'd say I'm pretty committed. So I think the path is pretty clear. I think that the military, as it does so often and so well, can lead. But I think that all of us are going to have to heed this call. All of us are going to have to do the things that we need to do, not only in switching sources of energy, but in using the energy that we have far more efficiently. And I will tell one more story. I set up a crowd-based platform, and the best ideas got up to me. Sailors and Marines would vote for them, and I started funding the good ones. And the first one that got to me was from a chief who said, change the light bulbs on your ships, or on our ships. And I didn't think that was much of an idea. Changing the light bulbs on one of our destroyers, so one of our smaller ships, from incandescent or fluorescent to LEDs, saves 20,000 gallons of fuel a year for a destroyer, and more as the number of ships go up. And they last for 7 years instead of for 6 months. And the light is better. And if you've ever been on a small ship, and the Navy calls destroyers and ships like that small boys, in rough seas, and the overhead where some of those lights are 30 or 40 feet above the deck, changing the light bulbs can get pretty sporty. So we know what we need to do, and we even know pretty much how to do it. The question now is, will we have the will? Will we have the persistence? Will we have the determination to do it, and to not only attack climate change, but to heal the world that we live in, and to leave it for the generations that succeed us. So thank y'all very much. Look forward to our conversation.
Thank you very much, Secretary Mabus, for that just fascinating insight into the challenges that we face ahead as a global community, and also how the Navy has led in this area under your leadership. I know that our audience is really engaged and excited because the questions are coming in for you from all over the state. So we're certainly going to have just a terrific conversation. I'm really looking forward to it. Right now, I want to introduce our other two panelists. And when I tell you a little bit about them, I think you'll see just how much they are going to add to this discussion, and what a terrific opportunity this is for all of us to have this variety of perspectives with us this evening. First, I'd like to introduce Andria McClellan, who is a Norfolk, Virginia City Councilor. Norfolk, of course, being the home of the largest naval base in the United States. She has been using her experience as an entrepreneur, a civic leader, community activist, parent of 3 school-aged children, and former planning commissioner to make meaningful and progressive change to the city of Norfolk. Unseating a 16-year incumbent in 2016, she was elected to serve a super ward city council seat for the 2nd largest city in Virginia because specifically of her innovation platform, which focused on diversifying the economy in the city home to the Norfolk Naval Base, and finding innovative solutions and funding to address sea level rise, and creating a more engaged, accessible, and transparent city government. Andrea, we are thrilled to have you here, and just very much looking forward to your perspective as a leader in the vicinity of the Norfolk Naval Base, as many of us sit, in my case, just blocks away from our Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. And your expertise is just absolutely invaluable to us tonight, and we're grateful to you for joining us. I also want to introduce our other panelist. Jeff Goodell is a distinguished author and climate change scholar and expert. His most recent book, The Water Will Come: Rising Seas, Sinking Cities, and the Remaking of the Civilized World, was a New York Times Critics' top book of 2017. He is the author of 5 previous books, including Big Coal: The Dirty Secret Behind America's Energy Future, and a contributing editor at Rolling Stone, where he has covered climate change for more than a decade. As a commentator on energy and climate issues, he has appeared on NPR, MSNBC, CNN, CNBC, ABC, NBC, Fox News, and last but not least, The Oprah Winfrey Show. We're definitely looking forward to hearing about that. Jeff is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and a 2020 Guggenheim Fellow. Jeff, clearly your expertise precedes you, and we're so excited to just hear your perspective on these very, very important issues. So with that, welcome to you both, and I will turn it over to Andria and Jeff for their remarks, and then we will have a discussion.
Great. Thank you, Maura. I appreciate it. Welcome, everybody. It's great to be on with a panel with somebody else who says y'all. Thank you, Secretary Mabus. So my name's Andria McClellan. I do represent the city of Norfolk, Virginia. And I want to give a shout out to a couple of my constituents who are incredible leaders themselves who helped me today. Retired Rear Admiral Ann Phillips, who is now the Special Assistant to the Governor on Coastal Adaptation, and Captain Doug Beaver, retired, who is now was the commanding officer for Naval Station Norfolk and is now our Chief Resilience Officer for the city of Norfolk, both of whom are on watching right now. And thank you guys both for helping me out. So we'll go to the next slide. This is going to be very quick. Just want to give you a couple pictures here. For those who may not know, Norfolk is part of what we call the Hampton Roads region, which is has one of the largest concentrations of military and federal assets in the country. We also are home to the largest naval base in the world, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more. The picture on the right illustrates Hampton Boulevard, which is one of the main arteries going in and out of our naval base. So we have approximately 40 to 50,000 sailors and civilians who access this base on a regular basis. And as you can imagine, and what we'll talk about a little bit more, are the challenges of getting on and off of that base. That road also accesses the Port of Virginia, which is the second busiest port along the East Coast. So in addition to a matter of national security with our base, it's also a matter of economic security when we can't get our goods on and off of the port. But most importantly, as a mom of 3 who's struggled previously to get my kid from school because of roads like this, it's just an issue of personal security and a quality of life issue. Just to brag a little bit about our region, we have 4 4-star commands, the Air Force's Air Combat Command, Army's Training and Doctrine Command, Navy's Fleet Forces Command, and NATO's Allied Command Transformation. We are home to the only NATO headquarters on U.S. soil. I'm very proud of that. We have more Coast Guard personnel stationed in our region than any other place in the country, including Washington, D.C. We have the largest naval base in the world, and Langley Air Force Base, the longest continuously active Air Force base in the world. So what does that mean for our economy? Approximately 40% of our gross regional product is contributed to by the military. So as you can imagine, DoD is a big issue for the Hampton Roads region. We'll go to the next slide here. So we talked about the largest naval station in the world and just a couple of facts about us, about it. It's really an incredible facility. And what should be noted is it has a plant value of $4.8 billion for replacement. And as it relates to sea level rise, it has 13 piers. And the replacement value for those piers would be over $1 billion. Some people argue, well, why does the Navy stay here? Because of the flooding. Well, you got to put ships on the water. And while Norfolk has flooding issues, we are not unlike other coastal communities. Ours flooding is a little more significant because we have a combination of sea level rise as well as subsidence with some of our land sinking. But truly, we are the tip of the spear, and we're just basically facing what any other coastal community is going to be facing. You'll note in here just the sort of the size of this structure. Again, the way DoD works, and I'm not the expert here on this panel, but typically they don't spend outside the gates. So the challenge is those roads that are going in and out, we are not receiving money from DoD to help support those. There was, and I'll get to this, federal legislation created called the Defense Access Roads Act, which will allow DoD to spend outside of the gates, but not for the purposes of resilience or flooding. So it's a bit of a challenge there. There is a new program called the Defense Community Infrastructure Program, which starts to provide funding there. I had a funding rate of, I think, $50 million this past year. That is nationally. So we'll go to the next slide. Just to give you some pictures, the top left is a picture on the base of the cars parked in the parking lot during a hurricane in the last 10 years. I forget, I think this is Hurricane Florence, I apologize. To the right, that is one of the major arteries in Norfolk, Virginia. This was taken a year ago in September. And what you see here is what we call Lake Olney. That is a major intersection. And that was due to just high tides, a bit of rain. And then we also experienced a lot of sunny day or nuisance flooding. The bottom two pictures are in my neighborhood. Indeed, the one on the right, my house is just to the left of the photo. And that's actually a road there that I use to go daily to City Hall. Today, as a matter of fact, while it didn't flood quite this much, this is more of a king tide situation. It was flooded to the point where I couldn't access that road. So this is a real issue, and we're seeing sunny day and nuisance flooding as a result of sea level rise on a regular basis. You add to that the increased precipitation and the rain bombs as a result of climate change, it's a double whammy for a city like Norfolk and for a naval base like Naval Station Norfolk. Go to the next slide. So these will give you some ideas of what we're expecting in terms of sea level rise for the region. Conservatively, we're looking at 1.5 feet of sea level rise by 2050, 3 feet by 2080, and 4.5 to 5 feet by 2100. Again, these are conservative numbers. I'm sure Jeff will have some ideas to comment on that. I recall from reading your book, these are very conservative numbers. But with that in mind, I would say that there's a Union of Concerned Scientists study that said that with sea level rise of just 1.4 feet, the naval base's low-lying areas would flood about 280 times each year, spending 10% of the time underwater. That is an issue of mission readiness for sure, if there ever was one. We'll go to the next slide. So this is just a quick bullet point list of the things that we're doing. We are part of the 100 Resilient Cities with the Rockefeller Foundation. We've rewritten our zoning code to make building here requirements are much more resilient. You have to build up higher. You have to create more pervious areas to retain water from a stormwater standpoint. You also have to provide outlets for solar and generators, et cetera. We got a lot of pushback from the building community when we introduced this because it does require a little more money up front, but it was the right thing to do. As Secretary Mabus said, you know, we got pushback, but you know, sometimes you just have to plan for the future, and I think it definitely is the right thing. We have implemented our own climate action plan. So in Norfolk, we typically talk about climate change as it relates to adaptation. It's coming, how do we handle it? Now we're starting to address mitigation. How do we reduce our carbon footprint? You have to do both. We are investing in offshore wind, and we think it's a great bet for the region, not only as a clean, renewable energy source. We also expect 5,000 to 10,000 jobs coming to our region because we believe we can be the supply chain for offshore wind of the East Coast. I'm assuming that there are going to be folks in the region of New Hampshire and elsewhere who might want to argue that fact, but we're going to be trying really hard there. Here's the issue for Norfolk and elsewhere. It comes down a lot to money. We have the plans, what we don't have is funding. We've identified $1.5 billion for tidal flooding projects as it relates to the U.S. Army Corps recent coastal storm risk management plan. That doesn't include the additional $1 billion for stormwater projects that would aid our precipitation flooding as well. So let's say it's about $2.5 billion. That's just for the city of Norfolk. Norfolk is a town of about 250,000 population-wise and a region of 1.7 million. We probably have over $40 billion of flooding projects here. We are basically not getting any funding for the most part to address any of these. We did receive a HUD grant as a result of the National Disaster Resilience Competition of $120 million, which is great. And we're implementing that right now with Captain Beaver at the helm. However, that's only going to be facilitating infrastructure in 2 small communities in Norfolk. We are looking at innovation, to Secretary Mabus's point. We've taken $5 million of that HUD money, and we've created an accelerator grants and encouraging entrepreneurs to create resilient technologies of the future. I'll just end with some of the areas where we're lobbying. We're trying to create a statewide board to address flooding. We're trying to get updated precipitation data. The state of Virginia is using NOAA Atlas 14, which really probably won't mean anything to most people, other than the fact that you should know that we're using precipitation data from 2006. So it's 2020. We're seeing rain bombs. We're seeing increased precipitation. So we are under engineering our stormwater and so much else within the state right now. And that also trickles down, no pun intended, to the local level. So that precipitation data needs to be updated there for sure. At the federal level, we are just trying to lobby as much as possible to get more funding at the federal level outside of the gates and from our partners there. And with that, the last slide is just a lovely picture of downtown Norfolk with just a little boat sailing on by. We welcome you. We love you in Norfolk. We don't flood all the time. We've got a great community, and I hope you come down and see us. And thank you to the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire and League of Conservation Voters, and to my good friend Rob Horner for inviting us today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andria. We really appreciate your comments, and as I said, the questions are just coming in at the rapid rate right now, and always a sign of terrific speakers and a really great conversation to come. So to all of you who are tuned in, please do keep sending in your questions via Facebook, YouTube, our chat function. We're going to hear from Jeff Goodell right now, and then we really look forward to diving into some of your questions and having a great discussion with our panelists. Jeff, with that, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Those were great presentations, Secretary Mabus and Andrew. Those were, I feel very like you guys have kind of covered the ground here. I just want to add a few things based on what I learned in my several years of writing this book about sea level rise. One of the things was, first of all, that my visits to Naval Station Norfolk were transformational for me and coming to understand what the risks of sea level rise were and how to think about them. I visited the base a number of times, but the most memorable time was with then Secretary of State John Kerry, who, as most of you know, understands the problems of climate change and national security very, very well and is very frank about talking with them. And I happened to be with him when we were on the bridge of the USS Theodore Roosevelt one day, and we were talking about the risk at the base to sea level rise, and he asked one of the chief naval operations officers who was there, he said bluntly, "How much time does Naval Station Norfolk have?" And the officer answered, 20 to 50 years. And to me, that was mind-blowing, just to hear it put out that bluntly and to say it that clearly. And Secretary Kerry sort of nodded and, understood what he was talking about. And it really changed my thinking about the enormity of the implications of sea level rise. And it also changed my thinking about how to deal with adapting and the risks, because it's very clear that the Navy has plenty of money if they really need it. They can spend money raising piers. They can do things to build higher seawalls. If they want to, they can make fortresses, right, against rising seas. But it doesn't do any good if, Andrea, as you pointed out, if you can't get there on the roads, if the railroads are underwater, if housing prices are declining because real estate prices are plummeting because of increased flooding. So it became clear to me that kind of saving naval station in Norfolk meant saving a large part of that region of Virginia. And the implications of that are enormous and profound, and exactly the kinds of things that I know you're working on really hard. And that to me was one of the key insights for me in the book, because it applies not just to the naval station, but to every city who's dealing with coastal sea level rise. Things like airports, right? You can raise houses, you can put up seawalls, but if the airport is flooded, it doesn't help much. And so these sort of large infrastructure problems and dealing with that was a fundamental understanding for me with the book. I just want to add 2 points to this conversation about sea level rise. I think that are widely misunderstood and might help just inform the conversation. One is about cutting carbon and the implications of cutting carbon emissions for sea level rise. Cutting carbon emissions, moving to clean energy is hugely important for all the reasons that Secretary Mabus, you talked about with the military and for national defense reasons, and that you talked about, Andrea, for jobs and everything. I don't mean to undercut that at all, but it's really important to grasp that even if we went to zero emissions tomorrow and we all, outlawed fossil fuel tomorrow, we still have between 10 and 30 feet of sea level rise built into the system. We are not going to stop it by cutting carbon to zero tomorrow. And that's because of the thermal inertia that's in the oceans, that's radiating heat out. It will continue to melt the glaciers in Greenland and Antarctica, which is where sea level rise comes from. It doesn't mean that even from a sea level rise point of view, that cutting carbon isn't important, because it can ultimately slow the rate and ultimate rise of this over centuries. But it's really important to grasp that, however good we are at cutting emissions, and of course we're not very good at it so far, we're not going to stop this. That's not going to happen right now. So I think that's widely misunderstood. The other thing I want to point out is this question of, the big issue is how much and how fast, right? And you pointed out the scenarios that Andrea, you pointed out the scenarios that we're using in Norfolk, and of course you have to have scenarios for planning purposes, but that also gets to one of the real problems of thinking about this is the uncertainty of this, and the difficulty of narrowing that range of what we might be looking at, And I saw this for myself firsthand last year when I spent 3 months on a ship in Antarctica, where we were looking at a place called Thwaites Glacier. It's a big glacier in West Antarctica that is, I think, as many of you may know, a lot of scientists thought that Antarctica was a very stable place until recently. Greenland was where a lot of the concern was, the melting of Greenland. That was what the main driver for sea level rise. But then about a decade ago, scientists came to understand that West Antarctica is vulnerable also. And it's vulnerable not in the same way as Greenland, but it's vulnerable because the warming ocean water is getting underneath the lips of the glaciers and destabilizing them in West Antarctica from below, which can lead to what's called marine ice cliff collapse, a rapid collapse of some of these big glaciers there. That has a lot of climate scientists very concerned as one of the major tipping points. And I was down there with scientists for 3 months looking at this, and it was a sobering experience, partly because one day we were right in front of Thwaites Glacier, and it was kind of a beautiful day and clear water, and we were in front of the ice cliff, but there wasn't much else around. We woke up in the morning and there were icebergs the size of aircraft carriers all around us, and we had no idea what happened until we saw a satellite image that night that was beamed down to us. And a piece of the ice shelf about 30 miles by 70 miles collapsed right there while we were there in real time. And so I talk about this because what's happening is that the risks, as we know more about ice sheets, as scientists learn more about ice sheets, are growing, not declining. While I was down there, I talked with Richard Alley, an ice scientist at Penn State, who's by most, I think by every standard, the top ice scientist in the world who probably knows more about sea level rise and ice instability than anyone. And I told him about what had happened, and he said, you know, this is why we can't rule out 10 to 15 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century, because of this instability in Antarctica. And this doesn't mean I'm not being alarmist and trying to say that this is going to happen. And neither was Richard Alley at that time being alarmist, but he was being alarmist, and I am too, I guess. But the clearer point he made was that this has never happened before. We humans, scientists, have never watched ice sheets collapse before. We don't really know what this looks like, and we don't really know how fast this can happen. And so when we see things like the instability of Antarctica, of West Antarctica, and we see the continued emissions, we see what's happening in Greenland, all the trend lines are getting towards higher sea level rise. And then the question becomes, in planning, how do you plan for that? It's one thing if we could say, oh, we're going to have 4 feet of sea level rise at the end of the century, and then in 50 years after that, it'll be another 3 feet. You could put engineers to work, it'd be no problem, right? But if you say, well, it might be 3 feet, but it might be 10 feet, then what do you do? How do you engineer for that? And that's one of the things that we're seeing around the world, you know, as people begin to build barriers and walls and thinking about this, is how do you engineer for uncertainty? And there's ways of doing it, but it has to be sort of in the process from the beginning. So anyway, that's my addition to the conversation. I'm happy to talk more about all of this.
Well, don't add any doom or gloom there, Jeff.
No, just trying to, you know, be the reporter telling you what I see.
Jeff, thank you for those invaluable insights. Look, we've got a handful of additional questions that came in just while you were speaking, and I want to thank everybody who has taken the time via various mediums to contribute here. Please do keep the questions coming. I'm going to try to get to as many as I can. It's certainly an active and engaged audience tonight. I think this is more questions than we typically see, which is terrific, and speaks so highly of our panelists. So please do keep sending them in, and we'll dive into a panel discussion. I want to start with a really, I think, excellent point that Bob from Manchester brought up, and thank you, Bob, for being with us tonight and for sharing your thoughts. You know, Bob mentions, you know, how can the military, you know, work to conserve energy, and the Navy, you know, continue to grow, you know, its forward naval sea power and presence. The rest of the military projecting a global power. And are we, while we do this, at risk of hampering our ability to protect our national interests? And I think, you know, with kind of that as setting the context from Bob, I'd like to ask the three of you, you know, to kind of fast forward a little bit, and hypothetically, you're sitting with the leaders of the Navy and the Pentagon and the new administration, whatever it should be, and you have the opportunity to you know, make the request for what you need and what they should be doing. You know, Secretary Mabus, from the vantage point of, you know, what should the next Secretary of the Navy do, and then, you know, Andria and Jeff, you bring a completely different perspective. You know, Andria, as a Norfolk City Councilor, you know, you mentioned the $2.5 billion for immediate projects, but $40 billion total. What's the ask so that we can prevent that and not have to do the sort of repair work, you know, of the $40 billion? So let me just, you know, kind of toss that out there for the three of you. Secretary Mabus, maybe you can lead us off. And again, Bob, thank you very much for the question.
Well, I'm very mindful of what Jeff said, that no matter what we do, there's a lot of sea level rise. There's a lot of things built into the system now. But we've got to do what we can to mitigate that difference between 3 feet and 10 feet. So if I was sitting in the Pentagon at the beginning of the next administration, I mean, I think you have to do some pretty bold things. And I do like that question from Bob. number one, get off fossil fuels. Just do it. We have the technology to do it now. We have the capability to do it now. And I think from our national security standpoint, we need to project that presence around the world. The United States Navy needs to be, as we put it, around the globe, around the clock, and because there are going to be so many different kinds of issues and threats coming by. But I would also say get off plastics. Mm-hmm. Transportation is one use of fossil fuels. Things like plastics and fertilizers are another one, and we could do that, and the military could do that. Finally, as I said, we have gone. When I was at Navy, we cut the use of energy and oil in particular. I mean, the Marines were using 63% less oil when I left than when I got there. And the Navy was using 16% less. It's doable. It's doable in things like the Navy alone has almost 50,000 non-combat vehicles. So cars and trucks and pickups and things that you see on the road with U.S. Navy stenciled on their sides. Those ought to all be electric. There shouldn't be an internal combustion engine among them. Things like that because the military is such a huge user, number one, we could cut down on a lot of the, and again, I've got it from Jeff, but just what we can do now. We'd cut down on a lot of the carbon emissions. But number two, because the military has always been a leader in areas of technology like this, it's going to get out to the civilian world pretty fast. Mm-hmm. And so I think you ought to, I think the time to be incremental is past. Yeah.
So I'm going to jump in here and great segue to Secretary Mabus. We have a lot of internal combustion engine cars idling on our roads and driving through those flooded areas. We need the Navy to encourage / enforce lack of not being in single occupancy vehicles. We need public transit. We need carpooling. I have a friend who works in planning here in Norfolk for the Navy, and they're sitting there planning more and more parking garages. We need to be doing the opposite of that. The sailors all want to drive their own vehicle on and off base. And I also serve on the Hampton Roads, our public transit agency, and we don't have many folks using our buses. Well, the bus doesn't have a special lane to get through it. It has to wait through base traffic as well. There's no incentive there. So to me, that seems like a quick fix. The Navy could really make a large impact there for sure. I would like to see things like we've talked about locally piloting composting. Composting and using the compost to, I think, help power the steam on base. Some things along those lines. I think reducing single-use plastics would be great, and just partnering with the local communities to try and find those innovation solutions that Secretary Mabus was talking about, and what we're doing with the RISE Accelerator here for sure.
That's great.
I will just add just a couple little things. One is that what Secretary Mabus said about getting off fossil fuels, I think is crucial for all the reasons that he talked about, and I think that the Navy's role as an innovator also is really important, and the possibility of developing technology that can be used for other things is hugely important. And obviously with sea level rise, I think beginning to make real moves about which bases to keep, what the strategy is as this world changes. And I know that the Pentagon, of course, has lots of talk plenty about that, but the politics of it are very complicated, and but that, that needs to move forward because the world is changing fast. And just the last thing is the way that my sense is that the fossil fuel empires are going to come to a more rapid close than we think. That I think that this shift is going to be happening very quickly away from fossil fuels in the next decade or so. And how does that change, sort of threat assessments? How does that change, power alliances? How is the military thinking about that? Which I know that they have been and gaming out. But I think that moment is upon us. I think we're really going to see a major shift in alliances and in a decline of fossil fuels in the very near future.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jeff. This next question really kind of builds on the current discussion. It's from Karen in Nashua. Karen, thank you very much for your thoughts and for sending this in. It's knowing what the rising sea levels will threaten many of the bases around the world. What steps do communities and naval planners, need to take to first prevent disaster? And I think, here, Andria, I'd love to start with you and, and thank you for sharing with us this evening, the very sophisticated work that, you and the fellow leaders of Norfolk have done, with the vicinity of the naval base there. I'm wondering what advice you can give to our own city councilors here in Portsmouth and throughout our seacoast in Newcastle and Rye and Northampton and Hampton and so forth. As we here in New Hampshire work with the leaders of the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard and also work with leaders in the United States Navy to either improve upon existing plans or start the process of building new plans. And any insights you could share from your experience, I think, would be very helpful to us here on the seacoast.
I think the number one thing I would start with is you have to act regionally. Water does not know geopolitical boundaries, and if you have each municipality working separately on different projects and not on a watershed basis, that's problematic. And then when you go to your federal elected officials, they feel like they don't know where to start. I mean, that's what we got from our senators saying, well, Norfolk, you're doing one thing, Virginia Beach, you're doing something else, Chesapeake's doing something else. And we realized we had to come together in a regional, collaborative way. So I think that's number one. Number two is we've recently joined the American Flood Coalition, which is the first group that I know of its kind that is dealing with flooding at a federal level and lobbying there. They've done work in Florida, they've done work in Virginia, but they're moving. I don't know if you all are working with them in New Hampshire, but might be something to check out there. Those would be the two things that we're doing. The other thing is just trying to ensure that residents are prepared and they have flood insurance. As bad as the flood insurance system is, which is really bad and broken, you still should have it. I say to people in Norfolk, if it rains where you live, you should have flood insurance. Not just because you're in a special flood hazard zone. And that really doesn't relate to the Navy so much, but it protects your sailors and their families. And, listen, when a sailor is out to sea, he or she doesn't need to be worried about whether or not their family is safe at home. And so it's really incumbent upon the localities to ensure that they have safe areas, safe roads, safe schools, and that their residents are protected in terms of storms.
Great. Anyone else want to jump in? If not, I will power through to some other questions.
Well, I'll just say one thing, which is I think everything Andria said is right on. But I do think that, in the biggest sense, what's going to happen in coastal regions and coastal cities that I've seen as I've gone around and talked to people, that's a very difficult thing, but is a kind of triage. I mean, you can't save every lighthouse. You can't save every house. Andria brought the question of money. There's a limited amount of money. There's a limited amount of septic systems that can be turned into municipal, sewage lines. There's a limited amount of seawalls that can be built. There has to be a kind of triage in some of these regions where hard political decisions are made about what we're going to put our money into and what we are going to let go in a way, and encourage people to leave, retreat, buyouts, all these kinds of things that are very politically complicated. But broadly, I think that this notion of beginning to acknowledge that not everything can be saved, and we're going to have to make some choices, is what needs to happen in the biggest way in these conversations.
So we completed a few years ago something called Vision 2100, where we literally did a civic engagement exercise, and we have plotted out areas throughout Norfolk as where we think things are going to be. And I'll tell you, it scared the hell out of residents.
Yeah, of course.
The R word, as we call it, retreat. If you're an elected official, nobody likes to talk about it, but it is absolutely something that's going to have to happen in some capacity. So we are buying out repetitive loss properties and things along those lines. There's just not enough funding to do it.
Right.
So.
And I don't think you're going to be able to count on a whole lot of funding from the federal level, because Congress tends to look at long-term planning as the next election. And while the military, Norfolk and everywhere else, has done lots of planning, lots of studies, nothing's going to happen until it is an absolute front-on emergency.
Most of our funding has always come as a result of a disaster, right? That's how the federal government typically works. Unfortunately, the return on investment for every dollar you spent pre-disaster, you save 7 to 8 to 10, depending on what calculation you use, for post-disaster. But that's just not the way the federal government works. And also with our Army Corps engineering study, they don't calculate the value of the federal asset. So having the largest naval base in the world doesn't get included into our benefit cost analysis. Mm-hmm. If it were, we'd be at the top of the list. So we're lobbying on that issue as well.
Well, I think just hearing from all of you is certainly making very, very clear and apparent that we need bold, decisive, and preventative action from the federal government, and hopefully that's something that we can see in the near future. We clearly need it, and then as Secretary Mabus mentioned and Andria mentioned as well, the time to be incremental is over. With that and sort of building on that thought, I want to kind of jump here to 2 questions from fellow Granite Staters. And Secretary Mabus, they were directed at you. I'm going to kind of combine them here. The first is, with the Secretary of Defense Esper saying that he sees the naval fleet jumping to over 500 ships, what would the impact of this be, environmentally? You talked a lot during your tenure as Secretary of the Navy about, our presence around the globe being our power, and our power, being our presence. The Navy being, America's away team and at the tip of the spear. How do you view that proposal? And then, furthermore, do you see the entire, Pentagon, the entire military, that is, ever being able to fully run on renewables? And if so, what type of timeline are we looking at for that?
Well, in terms of the fleet and what the Secretary of Defense said, we've had people talking about a 350 ship Navy for several years now. The Navy, my last report on how many ships we needed, we said we needed a few more than 350. Most of Esper's extra ships were small unmanned ships. And I do think that the Navy needs to begin to move toward smaller ships, toward lots more unmanned, toward, the whole world is getting smaller, quicker, cheaper, except the U.S. military, which is getting bigger, slower, more expensive. And so we've got to move toward that. I do think that presence is an incredibly valuable thing. The Navy is like the Marines or like the cops on the beat. They're there every day. The Army and the Air Force are like firefighters. They stay in the firehouse, they train, and when there's a big fire, they go out and fight it, and then they go back. There are no permanent homecomings for sailors and Marines. But if you take energy usage into account, you can use a lot less energy. We started building hybrid ships. Tom Friedman called them the Prius of the seas. And the first one was the Macon Island. It has an electric drive for speeds under 12 knots and a regular marine diesel gas turbine for speeds over 12 knots. Most ships don't travel very fast. Mm-hmm. So the first time we sent Macon Island out on a 9-month deployment, came back with more than half its fuel budget unused, and it stayed at sea 45 days longer. So if you move to a different source for fuel, if you move to far more efficient ships, and I mean, it's even things like these gee whiz stuff that the Navy Research Lab do. There's research on mixing seawater and the bottom of the ocean together to make hydrogen fuel. There's a lot of water, and as Jeff knows, there's going to be a lot more that you can have, and organic material is not in short supply. And so I think that it's just a willingness to do these sorts of things. I don't think it's a choice. I don't think it's that you have to say, well, we can't have this many ships, or we can't provide this sort of presence. We can't keep the sea lanes open because of this. I think you can, and you have to do both.
Thank you. Next question is from Jennifer in Manchester. And I really, Jennifer, appreciate you sending this in. I think this is sometimes a less frequently discussed aspect of the impact of climate change on global security. But Jennifer asks, as the Arctic and Antarctic melt, there's going to be a rush to claim resources. What role should the Navy, with our forward naval presence, our military, our State Department play in managing the inevitable conflicts that are going to arise over these competing claims?
I'll take a real quick stab at that. I think that, number one, we've got to not try to do it ourselves. The Arctic Council, five nations that are on the Arctic, most of them are NATO nations, except for Russia. And it's got to be a unified response. And you've got to try to enforce the rule of law, that it can't become the Wild West. And there are rules out there now, but enforcing it's going to require partnerships and things like that. Same thing in the Arctic. The Arctic has been declared a military-free zone, and the Antarctic, and it certainly should remain that. And I think that we should play a part in that, and our military should, but it's got to be in concert with our allies and our friends around the world. That this is something we cannot do alone.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Next question, and thanks everyone for continuing to send these in, and please keep them coming. I'm going to get to as many as possible in the final 12 minutes we have together. So thank you for all of you who sent questions in so far. Secretary Mabus, you mentioned during your talk, the need to do a better job as a government of taking care of our people during the transition, the folks who are transitioning from the fossil fuel industry jobs to clean energy jobs, through job training, through schooling. Can you just share a little bit more about, again, what I think is often overlooked here, which is this is a significant investment that is needed, and it's imperative we act now. And we know that the time to be incremental is over. But I think what we've all observed is, what's often glossed over here is this is also a very significant economic opportunity. and for places, sometimes forgotten towns like Berlin here in New Hampshire. I mean, what an opportunity for potential clean energy investment to create jobs and reinvigorate cities, retrain workers, and I just wonder if the three of you could maybe just touch a little bit on the potential upside and what this could do for our country and specifically for our small businesses in New Hampshire.
I think the upside is almost limitless. But every time you have one of these large shifts, I mean, systems don't change slowly. Systems tend to stay in equilibrium until they just change. And they change very, very fast. And we're in the middle of one of those now. But it's things like making training programs for solar jobs or training programs in other growing industries available. But it's also small things. If somebody is being laid off from a fossil fuel job, while they're doing that training, they've got to live. They've got to pay the rent. They've got to put food on the table. Help them there. That's an investment that will pay off. Make sure that they can get to and from the training site. To Andrea's point, with public transit or with transit vouchers or whatever, make sure they can do that. Childcare, if they have children that are going to need to be taken care of, make sure that there's enough childcare for these transitioning workers. I mean, it's not just transitioning workers that need childcare. It's America that needs more childcare. But there are some of these things that can be done that we simply haven't done enough of. We've just said the economy's changing. You're going to have to figure it out. And a lot of people don't figure it out, and they get left behind, and they get very understandably angry about it. They see the system as not as abandoning them. And I think that the government at every level, federal, state, local, and I was happy to hear what Andrea was talking about, but we can do a better job in moving people, because the future is in these new industries. Mm-hmm. We've never been static. I mean, just look at the things that we do today that 20 years ago we had no idea about. Cell phones. This, a remote conference, and the jobs that are created around that. So I think that the upside is huge, but it requires thought, and it requires a lot of action.
Great. Thank you.
Can I just quickly add,
absolutely.
I added the idea of environmental justice into the conversation. And I think as we are talking about jobs in particular, making sure that we are specifically focused on the underserved communities as well, who may not be aware of these opportunities. And it's not just a matter of having a job, it's making sure that there's folks are educated at the middle school level and then the high school level, and there's more advocacy working with our faith communities. It can't just be the way we always have done things. We really have to be intentional here. So I would just encourage, I hope there's a huge infrastructure bill coming in the future. And I hope that there are a lot of jobs and education training coming in the future, but it's got to incorporate some environmental justice piece with it.
Yeah. Agreed. Terrific point, and thank you for bringing that up, because it had not come up yet in our discussion, and I think we would certainly be remiss to have not touched on that. So I really appreciate it. And Jeff, you were about to say something.
Well, I just wanted to amplify this point about the sort of scale of the opportunity that is before us here. I grew up in Silicon Valley and worked with Steve Jobs at Apple Computer when he was still running around barefoot and quoting Bob Dylan lyrics to everybody. And we were in a little dentist's office.
Not that there's anything wrong with that.
No, nothing wrong with that. But I mean, you look at what's happened now to Apple, the most valuable corporation in the world, and it was like, this little dentist's office. And it's with this, when we talk about energy and climate change, it's really hard to bend our minds around the scale of what we're talking about, which is something that happened to me in Antarctica when I saw this enormous ice sheet collapse. But also the scale of the opportunity here, because we are going to dismantle and repower the energy infrastructure for the entire world. That is what's going to happen over the next few decades. And the opportunities for creativity, innovation, entrepreneurialism, jobs is just mind-boggling. And the quicker that communities and cities and people grasp that and move in that direction, the bigger those opportunities will be. And I just wanted to underscore that the sort of scale of what we're talking about here.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. I could not agree with you more. And I think it's, we certainly, I think as a country and as a global community have, a plethora of challenges that we face right now. But with challenges, we all know brings incredible amounts of opportunity. And I know for one, the opportunity that exists if we truly take, the bold and non-incremental action that, all three of you suggested and advocated for, to your point, as Secretary Mabus said, is limitless. And I think it's one of the most exciting opportunities for our country and for our global community over the next 10 years. We're going to try to get in one last question for everyone, and then a quick question that someone asked for Secretary Mabus. So as we think about this future of alternative energy, can each of you just, or potentially Jeff, maybe, can you just talk briefly about, the role of nuclear energy as we wean ourselves off of carbon-based? And this is coming from Alan in Andover. Alan, thanks so much for sending that in.
Nuclear energy, it always comes up. It is always the most controversial aspect of this. People have very strong opinions about nuclear power, clearly. I'm agnostic about it. Personally, I feel like it has been it's very valuable if we can make it work, if we can do it economically. There's lots of new next generation reactors that are being researched and built. China is pushing forward on this. I think that if we could make nuclear work at scale and solve the problems with the materials that are left behind, that would be an enormous help to solving our energy problem. And I think that's one of these things that it's impossible to kind of game out how it's going to work. We see a lot of entrepreneurial energy around other kinds of clean energy like solar and wind and biofuels and things. Nuclear is not really entrepreneurial in that same way. It depends on government support and sort of massive investments. I don't know. It would certainly be great if it worked, though, because it would certainly help replace coal plants and other fossil fuel power plants.
And I think this is one place that the Navy, frankly, can lead, because they're always the research they're doing on new reactors. And, they build reactors, small reactors that don't have to be refueled for 35 years. A normal commercial reactor, which is much larger and produces a lot more power, but has to be refueled every year or two. And so there is some entrepreneurial activity around it in Silicon Valley around small nuclear reactors that could be community-based. And the military, particularly the Navy, could do the proof of concept there, because people wouldn't worry as much about a small reactor being on a base where it's safe, or where it's guarded. And I think it's got some potential there, but you've got to figure out what to do with the waste, as you pointed out, Jeff.
Yeah, we've got a slew of little nuclear reactors about 2 miles from my house on the naval base, on those ships.
Yeah.
And last and very quick question for Secretary Mabus, and this comes from a great question from Roger, and it has to do with your leadership around the globe as a U.S. ambassador, as a governor, public company CEO, and then finally as the longest serving secretary since Josephus Daniels in World War I as President Obama's Secretary of the Navy. Where did you learn your leadership skills? And what advice do you have for there's a number of young aspiring sailors and Marines from around the Granite State that reached out to me in advance of this discussion. That were so excited that you were going to be coming here. And for those young women and men who are looking to raise their right hand and serve our country, what advice do you have for them tonight?
Well, number one, on leadership skills, the only way to learn them is to do it. Mm-hmm. And the very quick thumbnail stuff is make a decision. You'll never get perfect information. Make a decision. If it's wrong, change it. Narrow your focus. Figure out what's going to move the needle the most. And you're going to have to leave some stuff behind. But also communicate. Let people know what you're up to. Let people know how it affects them as individuals, not just how it affects national policy or the big picture, but how does it affect them? And to those sailors and Marines from the Granite State and from all over the country, you're one of less than 1% of this country that raised your hand and said, send me. You're the best we have. And you're going to be leaders whether you stay in the military or get out. You're going to learn those leadership skills. No place teaches it quite like the United States military, and particularly the Marines and the Navy. And I'll finish by saying just a very personal thing. I was the most dangerous thing in the Navy. I was 21 years old and I was a junior officer. I had 60 people, all men then. But I was their father, their mother, their banker, their priest, their rabbi, their psychiatrist. And it taught me responsibility and it made me grow up really fast. And I've had an incredibly fortunate life, but I'm not sure that I would have had the same opportunity if I had not served that time in the United States Navy.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Secretary Mabus. I want to, in closing, thank Jeff, thank Andria, and thank Secretary Mabus for being with us tonight. I know for all of us in the Granite State, where tourism is one of our biggest industries, and we spend our weekends at Mount Monadnock and Mount Major and in the Notch and skiing at Attitash and at Gunstock, and then our beautiful lakes and our precious coastline. Our natural resources are such a huge part of who we are, and we love them, and we are always so proud of them as well. So we can't thank you enough for sharing your insights and your expertise, and your perspective with us, and for this incredibly enriching discussion. I also want to thank everybody who joined. We had folks tuning in from all around the world, all around New England, and all throughout the Granite State. Thank you for the robust set of questions. I think we set a World Affairs Council of New Hampshire record. We appreciate that, and we hope that you will join us again soon. I want to thank the League of Conservation Voters, and especially my friend, Rob Werner, for his partnership in putting together not only this event, but this entire very, very important series on the impact of climate change. Rob, it's been terrific to work with you, and I'm so excited for the work that we'll continue to do together. And finally, to everyone, we hope you will tune in to our next event, which is testing the ties of the German-American relationship at a crossroads. It's on October 20th at 6 p.m., and it's headlined by a fantastic woman who is actually a classmate of mine at the Harvard Kennedy School, and is now at the Harvard Kennedy School Belfair Center, Catherine Kluber Ashwood. Make sure to tune in, and I wouldn't miss her. It'll be fantastic. So with that, I hope everybody has a good night, And thank you again for being a part of this discussion.